Hello, my name is Mary, and welcome to my channel where I examine the places where art and the esoteric intersect. Today I'm taking a look at an incredible artist who dissolved the borders of reality and the otherworldly to bring back her visions to the world. I'm talking, of course, about Hilma Af Klint. City Gallery in Wellington have an exhibition of her work opening in December, and I'm very much hoping to be able to attend. We've been in lockdown here for nearly 3 months, so I'm waiting to see if we're actually going to be able to travel to other parts of the country or whether we'll have to stay in our city. But hopefully there might be some opportunities towards the beginning of next year. So for those of you who are unaware of Af Klint, let me give you a short breakdown of her life and career before I get into some of the interesting stuff that I've been thinking about relating to her relationship with the art world and the esoteric world, where I want to look at her connection to an esoteric lineage rather than to her place at the forefront of abstract art. So back to the beginning of the story. Hilma Af Klint was born in Sweden in 1862 into a fairly middle-class family. She was interested in botany and maths from a young age, and she spent a lot of time in nature, being inspired by natural forms. She enjoyed painting nature and creating botanical drawings, which you can see carrying through her later art practice. She studied at the Royal Academy of Art in Stockholm, concentrating on portrait and landscape painting. After graduating with honours, she made something of a name for herself, and her painting was even a source of income for her. When she was 18, her younger sister died, and this is when she started to take an interest in the spiritual as she sought to find meaning in life and death. She became interested in Theosophy, a wildly influential spiritual system generated by one Madame Blavatsky in 1875, as well as Spiritism in general, which was wildly popular in Europe at this time, being concerned with mediumship and the spirit world. After completing her art school education, she formed a group of women called the Five. All were interested in the paranormal and mysticism. Through ritual practices, they recorded in a book a system of mystical thought in the form of messages from higher spirits who called themselves the High Masters. The Five experimented with automatic drawing and use of geometry as a visual language to conceptualize the unexplainable. This in itself isn't a new idea, but something that has been traditionally used in esoteric practice. Af Klint felt she was being guided by a force she didn't quite understand. It directed her to create paintings for a temple, but she was unsure what this meant and what this temple was meant to be. In her notebook she wrote, "The pictures were painted directly through me without any preliminary drawings and with great force. I had no idea what the paintings were supposed to depict. Nevertheless, I worked swiftly and surely, without changing a single brushstroke." It was her art practice combined with her interest in the otherworldly that came together to allow her to create some of the most extraordinary work of the early modernist era, making abstract painting in 1906, 5 years before the 1911 date claimed by Vasily Kandinsky as the first ever piece of abstract art. The works for the temple were started in 1906, consisting of 193 paintings, grouped within several sub-series. The major paintings, called the 10 largest, are extremely large and describe the different phases of life from early childhood to old age. Personally, I see them as a kind of initiatory process. They are filled with symbolic meaning and diagrammatic language, with colours, letters, shapes, all serving a narrative and descriptive purpose. It seems that the abstraction in her work served to transcend the physical world and the constraints of representational art, so that she could communicate the incommunicable. When she had completed the works for the temple, the spiritual guidance she was receiving ended, but she continued working with abstract painting, now entirely directed by her own creativity. The works were not to be broken up. They needed to be shown all together, and as such, she did have plans on how to build the temple to house the paintings, but unfortunately this never came to fruition. Interestingly, her design bears similarities to the spiral shape of the Guggenheim Gallery, where she had her most successful posthumous exhibition. Throughout her life, Af Klint kept many notebooks, 150 in total. The ones she created to accompany her temple work helped to decode her visual language, but they are also obviously assisting her in trying to understand what she was creating. This is fascinating to me because it speaks to the authenticity of the creation. She obviously truly felt that the inspiration was coming from outside of her. There is no sense that she is deceiving or trying to claim something she does not believe herself. I think it's important to note at this point that Af Klint was not an outsider artist. She had an art school pedigree, was aware of contemporary art, and the artist creating it. As far as we know, she was not suffering from any mental disturbances and she was able to be part of society. It's easy for the viewer to look at this strange, almost incomprehensible work and assume it came from someone divorced from the art world and maybe to some extent from reality, but that is not the case. This book from the 2018 Guggenheim exhibition has a lot of very interesting essays in it, and one of them is a conversation between 7 artist curators and art historians. I wanted to respond to some of their questions and the theories they put forth. There are some fascinating discussions to be had about this kind of art and its place in the contemporary Western art canon. The first point in this discussion is made by Amy Silman, who states that when she went to see the work at the Moderna Museet in Stockholm, she talked with a teacher from the Royal Academy who made the statement that Af Klint is not an artist, she's some sort of mystic. This statement is of particular interest to me as it's a sentiment that's also been levelled at my work. It's been postulated to me that perhaps art wasn't the best way to express my ideas, which seemed a very odd stance to take, seeing as art has been a conduit for mystic and spiritual expression for thousands of years. In point of fact, Af Klint follows all the rules for being considered an artist and not an outsider, with her art school pedigree, lifelong practice, and familiarity with contemporary art movements. Leah Dickerman suggests that the issue is that Af Klint maintained she was receiving the messages from somewhere else, rather than constructing a sustained theory of representation like Kandinsky. While I understand the point being made, I feel that it's taking art to a purely academic place, which therefore excludes some whole areas of expressive exploration and diminishes rather than elevates the scope of an artist's practice. These days, Western contemporary culture is very secular, which overall I feel is a positive thing, and of course that is reflected in contemporary art and academia. While the Western-centric art world seems to be finally relaxing its hegemony, leaving space for and even starting to encourage artwork which explores different cultural ways of knowing from around the world, it seems to struggle immensely with work created by Western artists which examine the same kinds of alternate ways of knowing, but from a Western cultural perspective. I believe this is a curious stance considering the immense popularity of Af Klint's overtly esoteric artworks. Perhaps it's okay to acknowledge that there is a craving in secular Western society for this kind of experience. The next interesting point discussed in the conversation is his studio visit from Rudolf Steiner. Austrian-born Steiner had his own spiritual movement, anthroposophy, and was heavily influenced by Goethe as well as by theosophy and spiritism. I guess he was kind of a big deal because he had a lot of success during his lifetime, and we still have Steiner schools to this day. He formulated a path, a theory, and put it out in the world to be followed. Instead of saying, here are some ideas to be examined, he said, I have a way and an answer, which is a risky thing to do and doesn't leave much space for questioning. I'm going to be quite honest and say I don't rate Steiner at all, and I imagine him to be pretty egotistical, despite his spiritual proclivities. So the anecdote told in this conversation from the book didn't particularly surprise me. So the story goes that he visited Hilma in her studio in 1908, where she proudly showed him her finished paintings for the temple. She was an admirer of his work, and so I think his opinion would have meant a lot to her. Unfortunately, he was less than enthused by her art or her mediumship. Lisa Florman suggests that Steiner probably wanted to bring her work in line with his own brand of spirituality, seeing her as a bit of a wild card and off doing her own thing. It also seemed that he doubted her mediumship, which suggests he thought her claims of otherworldly instruction were outright lies. Anyway, the studio visit from Steiner caused Af Klint to stop painting for 4 years. He had tried to steer her creativity in a direction that he felt was more appropriate, and thereby killed off her impetus to paint for a while. Interestingly enough, Steiner kept photographs of some of Af Klint's work, and later the same year he met Vasily Kandinsky, who had not yet come to abstract painting, which leads to the supposition that Kandinsky could have seen the photographs and perhaps was influenced by them while developing his own abstract work. Further on in the conversation, Anne Silman expresses the fact that R.H. Keetman described Af Klint in a way she hadn't thought of before, as a translator. For me, this was an immediately obvious description of what Af Klint does. Take something that cannot be described or explained and find a way to describe and explain it. For people coming to her work from an art historical or contextual standpoint, the work could appear unmoored and without points of art historical reference to work from. But to people coming from an occult standpoint, there are many familiar clues to the language she is using and what she is translating. Much like the fact she isn't an outsider artist but is grounded in the language of art, the same is true of her grounding in Western esotericism. It hasn't let fully formed out of thin air, except from the paintings known as the 10 largest. I find these images are the farthest removed from any familiar visual language, which is perhaps why they are also so very beguiling for so many viewers. I thought it would be interesting to look through some of Af Klint's work where I found reference to familiar Western esoteric themes. I found some images from the pre-Enlightenment to Enlightenment era that I really like and feel give quite a nice idea of historical esoteric thinking, where the artists were perhaps trying to translate an idea with intrinsically mystic content. These first two images are from her 1913 Tree of Knowledge series. The forms and colours have quite an Art Nouveau feel. The symbolism seems to draw from mystic Christianity. She's got a progression up or down the length of her tree with a chalice at the apex of both and divisions into different spheres or regions. You can see that she has visualised the movement, perhaps of some sort of energy, throughout the tree, up and down a central column. On the left here we have Athanasius Kircher's 1652 depiction of the Tree of Life, which is a diagram used in Hermetic Kabbalah and derives from Hebrew mysticism. On the right is a 1785 manuscript page showing the Tree of Knowledge of Good and Evil. You can see in these the way a diagrammatic method is used to illustrate and explain metaphysical ideas. They both show an emanatory system using spheres and pathways that represent the incorporeal. These two paintings are from the 1915 series The Dove, Dove number 1 on the left and number 9 on the right. I love how delicate and ephemeral these paintings are. Again, you can see the mystic Christian and Rosicrucian symbolism at play, as well as the upwards, downwards spiral movement that we also see in her Tree of Knowledge paintings. Here are some examples of the symbolism of the dove and how it appears in Western esoteric art. It's a very popular motif with the dove's appearance in both the Old and New Testament. On the left is a 16th century alchemical drawing showing the marriage of the sun and the moon, where you can see the dove moving down towards the intersection of their union. On the right is a 15th century alchemical drawing, which I like especially because it echoes the gentle watercolours used by Af Klint in many of her later starkly abstract works. And here we have a couple of Klint's later abstract works. On the left, Series 8, on the right, Series 7, number 7, from 1920. And these ones show early 16th century alchemical drawings. They don't have the beautiful colours used by Af Klint, and they are actual diagrams, hence the text that accompanies them, but they show the provenance of geometry in esoteric art. You can see a bit of colour use in the cross at the top of the right-hand page, and this will certainly have symbolic meaning in the choices of colour. Af Klint's use of colour as part of her symbolic language is in line with what I have seen from other artists at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. Someone like Ethel Colquhoun, who was interested in the magical potential of colours as newer, brighter, clearer pigments became available. After looking at these fascinating geometric diagrams, it's a perfect time to view Af Klint's 1915 altarpieces, which were part of her Paintings for the Temple series. I think these are just absolutely stunning and solidify her in my mind as the natural successor to the esoteric art tradition. Finally, these are her 10 largest from 1907. I think these are the most unusual and unique of her major works. In them, I can't see the influence of anything that has come before, which is what I meant when I stated that I felt her belief in the provenance of the work was authentic. She believed that she had been instructed, and it seems she used the visual tools she had to hand and that she was most comfortable with, her botanical and nature studies, her love of colour as a visual language. She was translating something for us, although she herself wasn't too sure what that message was. It does appear to resonate with many, considering the popularity of her exhibitions. As you can imagine, I've read many articles, reviews and pieces about Hilma Af Klint's work. Something I see throughout many of them is a tendency to cringe a little over the reason and motivation behind her paintings. The art world are at the same time fascinated by and embarrassed of her esoteric inspiration. I would love for this to gradually fade away and for her to be talked about as a whole being, with her work and her mysticism unapologetically embraced. Her mysticism doesn't need to be treated like a slightly embarrassing personality quirk, and it doesn't matter if the viewer, the reviewer, the writer believes her or not, it's irrelevant. What she has created or translated stands on its own merits, and let's face it, none of it would exist without her mystic exploration. You'd just have another reasonably decent Swedish landscape artist faded into obscurity. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed my dive into the esoteric world of Hilma Af Klint.